Now engines put out a tremendous amount of heat. If you don't dissipate the heat, the engine will get hotter and hotter, and eventually it'll melt inside. The bearings will go first because they're the softest, and then goodbye engine. And you might say, Scotty, but there's air-cooled engines, they don't have radiators. How come they don't melt? Well, they use the oil as coolant. Like my Triumph motorcycle there. It even has a giant oil radiator in the front to dissipate the heat. They use the oil to dissipate the heat and the air going over the fins of the engine. They're still using a liquid, in this case oil, to cool the engine. And these cooling systems have a few main components. They have the radiator that dissipates the heat. They have some type of cooling fan that sucks air through it when you're going at lower speeds. They have a water pump that pumps the water through the engine into the radiator and back in again. And they have this little piece here called the thermostat that allows the engine to warm up faster. It stays closed when the engine is cold, so the engine can warm up and the water doesn't go from the engine to the radiator and cool. And then once it gets hot, the little valve inside, it expands, it opens up, then it lets the hot water from the engine go through the radiator and be dissipated to the atmosphere. Now here I'm going to start with something no one ever thinks about, the thermostat. It's hidden inside the engine. You can't see it. It's inside here in a little housing. Has two bolts holding it on. And as you drive, they open and close thousands of times. But if they ever stick shut, your engine's going to overheat. So it's a good idea, just for peace of mind, every 4 or 5 years, change your thermostat so it won't stick. And take my advice. Buy OEM, original equipment thermostats. Yeah, maybe you'll spend $25 instead of $9.95, but it's saving your engine. Buy the original equipment one so you don't have to think about it for years and years. Because over the last 51 years of fixing cars, I've had customers, they had a cheap one put into their car, stupid thing stuck shut eventually, and they ended up blowing their engine. They were on the highway. Next thing they knew, the temperature was at the H and the engine stopped running. And in most cases, changing the thermostat isn't that big deal. Like I said, this has two bolts holding it. Now, there are some cars, like some of these crazy Volkswagen. Hey, some of these things, you got to practically take the engine apart to get to them. That's just their crazy design. And some of them, like those Volkswagens, are electronic. They're not just a simple mechanical thing. They're run electronically. And they cost a lot of money. They do break down more often. I think it's a stupid design, but hey, that's the Germans for you with their high tech and more efficiency. Now the next thing that's often forgotten is the radiator cap. It's a pressurized system, so it's got to hold a certain amount of pressure. Check them every once in a while. If you see the rubber inside's all cracked, sometimes on these Japanese style ones, this plastic piece here breaks and falls off, so you buy a new one. And they will just lose the spring pressure over years and years. So again, maybe it's a good idea. Buy a new cap every 4 or 5 years. And here's another trick to make your cooling system last as long as possible. I've been using this AT205 reseal for years. Got a whole bottle of it here. I put it in an old Windex bottle. You can spray it all over the rubber hoses to keep them from cracking. It's a rubber rejuvenator. It keeps the rubber nice and supple. Heck, I showed some guys I know who play golf this. They put it on the handles of all their golf clubs and they said, man, they lasted so much longer because it kept it all from deteriorating from all the sweat in their hands and whacking and pressure of hitting the golf ball hard. And here's some proof right here. The rubber seal on the headlight. This is a 25-year-old rubber seal. It's still pliable and looks good because I've been using AT205 reseal on it since I bought it about, I don't know, 14 years ago. Make sure you have good airflow going through it. Plastic bags can get sucked in there. And if you live out in the country in the summer and drive at night a lot, you're going to get it covered with bugs. Hey, those little bitty holes that the air goes through, they get blocked by a bunch of bugs. It's not going to cool right. So look in there every once in a while. See if there's any bugs stuck on there. Just remember, the radiator is here, but you have the condenser in front of it. So you have to check the condenser too, because the condenser has the air go through that before it hits the radiator. And in most modern cars today, the AC condenser, it's in front of the radiator. So you got to make sure that isn't covered with bugs or plastic or anything that would stop airflow, especially in the summer. Hey, check it every once in a while, because if those bugs are on there, it gets hot. They'll bake on, they'll be really hard to get off. If you check it every once in a while and then hose it down with a water hose, you can get them off a lot easier than if they've baked on, and they can be a royal pain to get off then. But if they do get baked on, heck, you can go to one of those car washes that has one of those magic pressure wands, and you can squirt it all over and get the stupid bugs off. Now the next thing to check are the cooling fans. This one has 2 cooling fans. So turn the AC on full blast, then check the fans. This one's blowing, and that one's blowing. They're blowing fine. When you turn the AC on, that'll make all the fans run if it sits for a few minutes. You gotta make sure both fans work. I've had many customers over the years have cars where one fan was burnt out and the other one wasn't. And even though the car ran okay, it was running too hot. You don't want to strain an engine by having it run too hot just because some stupid fan motor wasn't working. Now, of course, you want to keep your car's coolant clean. Modern coolant lasts an awful long time. Whatever yours is set up for, change it then. Some of the modern Toyotas, hey, they can go 7 years, 150,000 miles before you have to change them. So just follow that if you keep your cars that long. If you don't have to do anything. But if you keep them long like me, of course, you have to change the coolant when it's time, because additives all break down over time. And even though cars used to be cast iron and they rusted, now they're aluminum, aluminum actually corrodes just as bad as iron rust, and the corrosion will build up. And when it comes to the radiators themselves, here's a tip for modern cars. When I was a young mechanic, radiators were made out of brass and copper. When they got old and dirty, we had some good acid flushes. We could flush all the corrosion out of them, clean them up, and then drive down the road. But modern radiators, they're made out of plastic and aluminum. It's lighter weight, and the main reason is it's so much cheaper to manufacture them. But these radiators, they don't really flush. When they get corroded inside, pretty much you throw them away and buy another radiator. Because not only are modern radiators aluminum, they have smaller holes in them. The old radiators had big passageways that you could clean out okay. But the new ones, they're so tiny inside that you try flushing it, it just pushes the crud into a little hole further and doesn't often fix it. And here's a little tip on how you can check to see if your radiator's clogging up inside. These temperature guns are cheap as heck now. This one was like $20. When a vehicle's running, you can take temperatures of various parts of the radiator. Because if you haven't found a problem anywhere else, it could be your radiator just doesn't dissipate heat anymore. This shows it quite well, and in a rather strange way too. Because when you're taking the temperature, if you find one area is a lot colder than the rest, that means that that area is clogged up. Now that sounds crazy, but it is logical. Because if you have a blockage in one area, none of the coolant is going through there. So that's not going to be hot like the surrounding areas that have hot coolant going through it. Even though that particular area itself is cool, because it's blocked up, it's not cooling the engine down, it just makes the engine hotter. Just think, if your entire radiator wasn't getting hot and was cold, that would mean nothing flowing through it, and it would really overheat. So when you find areas that are cold, that means your radiator's shot and you need another one. You can take advantage of the cheaper radiators because they cost a lot less. Over the years, I have bought aftermarket plastic and aluminum radiators from many different manufacturers. And truth be told, they all work perfectly fine. I had a guy with a BMW once, and the dealer wanted $900 for a radiator, and I got one for like $129. It was made in China and it worked perfectly fine. Now, all modern cars use a variety of oxygen sensors. Technically, this is an air-fuel ratio sensor. These things screw into the exhaust system, and they measure indirectly what kind of gases are in the exhaust to make the car run perfectly and not pollute. Now, this particular car's got 4 of them on it. In this case, it's tripped a code to check engine light is on. In this case, it's P0051, heated oxygen sensor, heater control circuit low bank 2 sensor 1. The sensors send feedback to the computer. They can be affected by if your car's running rich, lean, if you got a bad catalytic converter, if you've got bad fuel. There's all kinds of reasons that they can trip codes for just the sensors. This is a Lexus, a Toyota product, and they have a known problem. Inside these stupid little sensors is a heater, kind of like your hairdryer heater. And that's so that when you start the car, immediately it heats up. And it works efficiently at lower operating temperatures when you start the car. And these stupid heaters inside those sensors break down all the time on these. Now the car can run perfectly fine. This thing's running perfectly fine. But you can't get your car inspected because it's got that code for a problem with the anti-pollution system, the oxygen sensor. So in the case of this Lexus, the most logical thing to do is to just change out that sensor. Now it's called Bank 2 Sensor 1. Well, there's 4 of them on here. How do you know which one that is? Well, here's how you tell on any engine. This is a V8, so there's 2 banks. There's Bank 1 and Bank 2. Well, Bank 1 is the side of the engine that has the number 1 cylinder, and Bank 2 is the opposite side. So in the case of this Lexus, the driver's side has the number 1 cylinder, so bank number 2 is the opposite side, the passenger side. And the code was for Bank 2 Sensor 1. Well, Sensor 1 is the sensor before the catalytic converter. So it's the first one off of the exhaust manifold. Jack it up and see where it is. This thing is so low to the ground. You gotta jack it up to get under it and look at anything. And we don't want to be squashed, so I'll go to the jack stand. Then we go under the car. You'll see, you really can't see anything because all this plastic crap is in the way. So we got to take some of the plastic crap out of the way so we can work on it. So we'll take a bunch of these off. And now when we go up here, we can see the oxygen sensor right there. There's the front one. And if we go back past the cat, there's the rear one behind the catalytic converter. But we're changing the front one. That's in the front. Now the first thing you have to do is disconnect the clip. And it is a stinker. You got to squeeze and pull. But eventually, as you can see, I've got that end unplugged. It is a real stinker. These are one of the worst design plugs on the planet. I don't know why Toyota makes these. They're absolute scumbags. Yeah, they're real easy to put together because they click on, but they're almost impossible to get off. You just have to keep squeezing and squeezing until they finally click and snap off. Now, when we go back to the other end here where the oxygen sensor is, you need an oxygen sensor remover tool. You'll never get it off otherwise. The tool itself just slips over the sensor. Then it's on there, and you put a ratchet on it. Here's a better shot where you can see it. There's the wrench. And you put a ratchet on that and pull on it. Here's the ratchet with a long arm. Fits on it, and you just... and it comes off. There it is, and once it's loose, you can just get your hand and it'll spin off. You can see it just spins freely. You just keep turning it until it comes off. There it is, we got it out. Then you just get your new oxygen sensor and screw it in the hole. Up it goes. Just screws in by hand, you spin it in, and once it's spinned in, you put the wrench and get it nice and tight. There it is, it's down, inside, in. Now you want to make it tight because you don't want it leaking. And of course, fish the line through here so that you can plug it into the other end and click it in. Now, as you can see here, it's a one-hand job clicking it in. There it goes, click. They're very easy to put together. They're hellacious to take apart, but they're made for building, not for taking apart. Then, of course, you got to bolt all the stupid plastic crap back on. It's annoying, but that's how they make cars these days. And voila, we'll just let it down and take it for a road test. Down she goes. Away we go. And as you can see now, the check engine light is off. All those lights went off. Now, over the past 100-something years, spark plugs do one basic thing in a gasoline engine. They fire the air-fuel mixture, so there's an explosion that pushes the pistons down. Now, the early spark plugs, hey, they didn't fire all that great. The really early ones, you could actually take them apart into different pieces, clean them, fix them, put them back together, and use them over. And after that, for decades and decades, most spark plugs had copper electrodes in them. Copper's a good conductor of electricity. So they would conduct the electricity, make the spark that would fire the gasoline air mixture. But if you know anything about copper, hey, it may conduct electricity quite well, but it's extremely soft. So what happens is it would wear out in a reasonably short period of time. Back in the day, when I was a young mechanic, hey, you'd be lucky if you got 20,000 miles out of a set of spark plugs. Sometimes we had to change them even closer if it was an engine that was worn and burned some oil. So they didn't last all that long. Then they went to platinum spark plugs because platinum, hey, it's much harder. It keeps its sharper edge along. And where the spark plugs fire, you want a sharp edge for the spark to fire correctly. Platinum spark plugs can easily last 100,000 miles. And another advantage of the platinum spark plugs is they generally run a little bit hotter than the copper plugs do. It's running hotter, They burn the deposits that get on your spark plug off better, so the spark plugs can last a lot longer. Even if your spark's firing right, if it gets clogged up with unburned carbon parts, it won't fire right. But then came iridium spark plugs, the top of the line ones now. Iridium is 6 times harder than platinum, so it lasts even longer. Plus it has a 700-degree hotter melting point than the platinum does. So they can last an awful long time, these iridium spark plugs. I've personally seen some Chevy V8 engines that had 200,000 miles on them, and the iridium plugs had never been changed and it still ran fine. Now, of course, the iridium ones cost more, but hey, the price keeps coming down. Now you can usually get them for $7 or $8 a piece. And there's a big reason that many engines now use iridium plugs from the factory, and that's because they're making spark plugs harder and harder to get to. As an example, this Lexus behind me is a V6. The front 3 cylinders are real easy to get to. They're out in the open, the front 3, simple to get to. But the back 3 are under the intake manifold, and you have to take the intake manifold plenum completely off to get to those 3 spark plugs. It is a gigantic job. And there's many modern engine designs that are even worse than that. Some of them you practically have to pull the engine out of the car to change all the spark plugs. So iridium makes sense. If you can get 200,000 miles out of a set of spark plugs, hey, most people are going to be happy with that. Now the copper, then the platinum, then the iridium, those are the 3 main plugs that go into cars. But there are a bunch of these wild and crazy manufacturers that design plugs that have 4 electrodes or are made out of even different materials, and they claim they boost your horsepower and make you get better gas mileage. Well, stay away from that stuff. It's just nonsense. Now, ages and ages ago, a spark plug design could have made a change, like in the 60s, where you had points and condensers just mechanically opening and closing and firing the spark plugs through the distributor. A lot of those systems didn't have all that much power. And if you replaced the stock spark plug and hose with one that fired better, they would have actually run better. But it's been decades and decades since there's points and condensers. All the systems are electronically controlled now. The stock spark plug that comes with the car is what's designed for the car and will generally work best. Again, it's 94 silica. Hey, it's got electronic ignition in it. The stock Nip and Denso is the best plug for it. It was designed by engineers. It's the right fit. And speaking of the right fit, let me tell you a horror story. Years ago, I had a customer come over with a 300Z Nissan sports car, and it was clacking like mad. And I said, well, when did this start? And the guy said, well, I changed my spark plugs. And right after I changed the spark plugs, it started making all that noise. So I said, okay, let's stop right there. I pulled out one of the spark plugs. I looked at the spark plug, and I could see the top of the spark plug was hitting something. It had metal shiny parts on it where it was wearing. Well, nothing's supposed to touch the top of the spark plug in the engine. I went to my auto parts store and got a set of 6 spark plugs, and I measured them against the spark plug that I'd taken out. Well, it turned out that the spark plugs he installed were like this much higher. Instead of fitting flush like this, they stuck in the engine this much higher. And it was actually hitting the top of the pistons. It turns out he used a discount auto parts store, and the software that they had, strangely enough, was typed up in South Korea. Who knows these days what kind of technology goes on. And one of those guys made a mistake, and they said that these long spark plugs belonged in his car that had shorter spark plugs. They sold them the wrong ones. Now, he was extremely lucky because he did it fast and brought it to me, and I put in the right ones, and after about a day of driving, the noise went away. So it didn't really seem to have damaged it in the long run, even though that noise was pretty rattling to his peace of mind when he started it up and heard it. So really, you can't beat the stock spark plugs. Always try to get the same exact spark plug the car came with. And don't trust anybody. Take one of your old ones out. When you take it out, you can either match the number, this has a big number on it, or at least when they sell it to you, match it up to make sure it's the same size, and that's exactly the same length of threads as your old one, because you don't want one that's too deep, that's going to hit the pistons, or one that's too shallow and it won't fire the flame correctly. Engineers spent years refining engine designs, refining the spark plugs that go in them. You're going against all that knowledge if you decide to swap out to a different spark plug. It has to be the right size. and it has to be the correct heat range for normal driving. But that said, there is one exception. You had a car that say came with a platinum spark plug or a copper spark plug, you could upgrade to an iridium spark plug if an iridium spark plug is made that will fit in there. You're not going to get more horsepower, you're not going to get better gas mileage, but you're going to get longer life. Like in that Lexus, it didn't come with iridium plugs, but I put them in because it was such a pain to take that manifold off. I put in iridium spark plugs. Now I have to admit, the platinum spark plugs that I took out of it had nothing wrong with them. I had to take off the valve cover gasket on that side because even though it was a Lexus, things wear out eventually, and it was 16 years old, and the stupid little rubber gasket on the valve cover was leaking oil. I figured as long as I'm taking that manifold off so I could change the valve cover gasket, I'm going to change the spark plugs too. If they make an iridium spark plug that will fit in your engine when you go to an auto parts store and they look it up and you match it with the old one, it's the same size, go right ahead and put an iridium version of the original spark plug. But don't think that there's some magic spark plug out there that's going to make your car run better by some crazy design that somebody thinks is going to work inside an engine better than what the engineers designed it for. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.